All right, let's continue learning about the aggregate market. And you can see what I have here. For reference, I have a product market graph drawn over here. Here is the aggregate market with only short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Here is the aggregate market, but without the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. It's only the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, I want you to understand that we're eventually going to get to a place where we're going to take these two graphs, we're going to put them on top of each other. So we're going to draw the long-run aggregate supply curve in there and talk about the relationship among all three of the curves. Now, in product markets, one of the things that you learned is that the supply and demand fluctuate. I've said this several times, and it's important that you understand that demand is a fluctuating force. You personally want to buy something today that you did not want to buy, let's say, 3 days ago. Sometimes it's hour by hour. In the morning, I don't want a cup of coffee, let's say, but then later in the afternoon, I really want a cup of coffee. I know that sounds weird, it should be the other way around, but anyway. You might say in the morning, oh, I hate donuts. But by 10 a.m., now all of a sudden you think of one particular kind of donut, and now all of a sudden you want to go buy that donut, okay? But I'm not as concerned about the minute by minute or hour by hour fluctuations. I'm more concerned about the sort of more medium term fluctuations. When people get a raise, now they have more money, they can buy more stuff, demand increases. Wages go up, and so in an industry, and so suppliers have to pay their employees more money, so that means production costs have gone up. When production costs have gone up, they can't make as much, so supply decreases. When these fluctuations in supply and demand occur, you have already seen in a previous lesson that quantity or equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price will change. So when demand increases, we'll have a new intersection of the supply and demand curve, and we'll have an increase in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity. Well, this equilibrium also exists in the aggregate market, and the fluctuations in supply and demand also exist in the aggregate market. Short-run aggregate supply. There are things that can happen in the economy that will cause short-run aggregate supply to increase. There are other things in the economy that will cause short-run aggregate supply to decrease. Aggregate demand, same thing. There are things that will happen in the economy that will cause aggregate demand to increase. And then there are things that will occur in the economy to cause aggregate demand to decrease. So in the aggregate market, short-run aggregate supply fluctuates. We've already said that with the business cycle, right? Aggregate demand also fluctuates. And when those things fluctuate, their equilibrium, which again occurs at the intersection, their equilibrium will fluctuate. Not so with long-run aggregate supply. Long-run aggregate supply is stable. It is unaffected by price level. But just because it doesn't fluctuate up and down, it does change over time. As we increase our stock of factors, and as we increase the productivity of factors, that will increase overall our productive capacity. And when our productive capacity increases, these things will increase our productive capacity. And as our productive capacity increases, we can produce a larger quantity of stuff in the economy. And natural real GDP, or long-run aggregate supply, will increase. So this line, in a healthy economy that is growing, the long-run aggregate supply curve, it's not staying still, it is moving to the right over time. It is increasing, but it's moving so slowly that when we look at the graph, when we look at the aggregate market graph, we assume it is not moving. We assume it is stable. So we will never, when dealing with the dynamics of the aggregate market, we will never say, hey, let's move the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. That's not how it works. That's not how our economy works. These forces are fluctuating so fast back and forth, while the long-run aggregate supply curve doesn't move at all, that we just assume that the long-run aggregate supply curve is stable. It stays vertical right there where it is. Okay? And so what we're now going to move on to is we're going to talk about the dynamics and the ideas of what happens when aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply move, and we're also going to talk about the equilibrium of the aggregate market. All right, so in a product market where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect, that is where buyers and sellers agree, right? This is the point of agreement, okay? And we call that equilibrium. That's where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And the result is equilibrium quantity. It is the price where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So at one price, we have one agreed upon quantity. And we call it equilibrium, right? Now, when the supply curve shifts to the right or to the left, that equilibrium point will change. And the equilibrium price will increase or decrease, and the equilibrium quantity will increase or decrease if either supply or demand changes. If we have a change in supply, the curve moves. If we have a change in demand, the curve moves. And you are expected to know what would happen if there was an increase in supply or a decrease in demand. I would ask you questions like, when demand increases, what happens to equilibrium price? What happens to equilibrium quantity? Well, the same thing is going to happen over here in the aggregate market. The short-run aggregate supply curve and the long-run aggregate demand curve are going to fluctuate. And when they fluctuate, you have to know what happens to the equilibrium. Now, the good news is what's going to happen to the equilibrium here is exactly what happened to the equilibrium here. And so you can take your knowledge of dynamics in the product markets and apply that same concept to dynamics in the aggregate market. All right? So, but what we have to talk about first, we've got to talk about this equilibrium. What does equilibrium mean? As aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply fluctuate, as they fluctuate in the economy, here's what happens. Overall prices in the economy which we understand as the price level, also fluctuate. The overall prices fluctuate. Also, overall output quantity, aggregate output quantity, okay, when I say overall, I mean aggregate, so aggregate prices, we have a name for that, price level. Also, overall output quantity which we call GDP, fluctuates. And when I say GDP, we measure it by real GDP, but it's still gross domestic product. It is the overall amount of product that we produce. Now, we know that because the short-run aggregate supply curve is an upward sloping curve and the aggregate demand curve is a downward sloping curve, they will intersect in one place, okay? And that place where they intersect, again, is a point of agreement. So where aggregate demand and aggregate supply, or short-run aggregate supply, where they agree, we have equilibrium. Meaning, where they agree is where they intersect, right? we have equilibrium in the aggregate market. In the aggregate market. Now, here's what we need though. So now we need a name for equilibrium price, and we need a name for equilibrium quantity. Just like we changed the name of supply to short-run aggregate supply, we changed the name of demand to aggregate demand. We changed the names of everything because we moved everything up from just one thing in one market into all of the things in the entire economy. And we do have special names for these things, okay? So where they agree, the price level at equilibrium, the price level is the economy's consumer price index, or CPI. Okay, so where aggregate demand, overall demand for stuff, and overall supply for stuff, when all the buyers agree with all the sellers on all the stuff they're going to buy at the different prices, those prices are now the final prices that everybody's buying for at that particular time in the economy. And that is the price level. And the way that we measure the price level in the United States is with the basket of goods, and that is the consumer price index. So the CPI is going to measure at a particular level. And the CPI fluctuates. When we have changes in this equilibrium, if aggregate demand moves to the right, we're going to have an increase in the CPI. And so the CPI number is going to be larger. Okay? All right. The real GDP at equilibrium, this is real creative. I'm being sarcastic. Real GDP at equilibrium is called equilibrium real GDP. It's called equilibrium real GDP. Okay, and so here, this equilibrium point, equilibrium quantity is equilibrium real GDP. And we can represent this as real, well, I'm probably going to write it a lot. You'll see me writing this a lot as RGDP with a little E there, equilibrium real GDP. And so now we have a complete aggregate market graph. And what we're going to do now is we are going to look at, we're going to set aside long-run aggregate supply for a little while, and the last thing we're going to do today in this lesson is we are going to look at the dynamics of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand and how CPI and equilibrium real GDP change. All right, so here's what we're going to do in this part, is we're going to see what happens when we have the different kinds of fluctuations in the aggregate market. Now, generally speaking, there are 4 kinds of fluctuations that you're going to see. And we're going to draw each one on each one of these 4 graphs. We have 4 basically identical aggregate markets over here, and we're going to fill in this chart over here with the changes that occur. Now, I want to remind you that this is basically the same thing as product market changes in supply and demand, only this time it's going to be changes in aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. And so each one of these things, short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, each one can only change in 2 ways. They can either increase or they can decrease. And because each one can only increase or decrease, that's only 4 kinds of changes that we can see in the aggregate market. So what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at what happens when there's an increase in aggregate demand We're going to look at what happens when there is a decrease in aggregate demand. We're going to look at what happens when there's an increase in short-run aggregate supply. And we're going to look at what happens when there is a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Now, the first thing you need to understand is, what do these four changes, what does each one look like on the aggregate market graph? Well, I want to remind you that our curves do not go up or down. They do not shift up or down. They shift left and they shift right. And so we have to try and figure out, is left an increase or a decrease, and is right an increase or a decrease? Well, mathematically, on a horizontal plane, the way that we draw the coordinate plane in math is leftward, okay? Left is a smaller number, right? So left is a smaller number, which means a decrease. And right is a larger number, which means a rightward shift is an increase. I'm reminding you of that because we already did that previously. So rightward shift is an increase. So also, when aggregate demand is the thing that's changing, it's the aggregate demand curve that is changing. Therefore, an increase in aggregate demand would be a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. And so what's going to happen is we will have aggregate demand will shift to the right. Decrease in aggregate demand, that would be the aggregate demand curve shifting to the left. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to mark these. This one is going to be an increase in aggregate demand. This one is going to be a decrease in aggregate demand. This one is going to be an increase in short-run aggregate supply, and this one is going to be a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Okay? So a decrease in aggregate demand would be the aggregate demand curve shifting to the left. An increase in short-run aggregate supply, increase means to the right, so the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right, and then decrease in short-run aggregate supply, that means that the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. Okay? All right, now let's look at each one and how that will affect CPI and equilibrium real GDP. Well, an increase in the aggregate demand would cause a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So here's the aggregate demand curve. And to show a rightward shift, I'm going to put right arrows. I'm going to put a right arrow there and a rightward pointing arrow there. And so then I'm going to draw a new aggregate demand curve that is to the right of our old aggregate demand curve. And I'm going to put AD prime. And so that's our new aggregate demand curve. And then I'm going to go to the new intersection point to where the new aggregate demand curve agrees with the short-run aggregate supply curve. And I'm going to put some dashed lines over to price level and a dashed line down to real GDP. And as you can see here, what happened was the CPI increased and equilibrium real GDP also increased. And so when we have an increase in aggregate demand in the economy, it will result in an increase in CPI, and it'll also result in an increase in equilibrium real GDP. Let me tell you what I think you should do right now. I think you should pause this video, and I think you should try and do aggregate demand on your own, and then you can replay the video, and then you can see if you got the same thing that I got. All right, so let's do a decrease in aggregate demand. A decrease in aggregate demand is going to be a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Well, here's the aggregate demand curve, so I'll draw some leftward arrows. There's a left arrow, there's a left arrow, and so the aggregate demand curve is going to move. It's still going to be downward sloping, but it's going to be to the left of the original one, and so now our new aggregate demand curve, AD prime, is over here to the left. And now I'm going to find the point of intersection, which is right here, and and I'm going to draw a horizontal dashed line over to the price level and a vertical dashed line down to the real GDP. And here's what you can see. You can see that the CPI, the original CPI was in black up here, and now the new one is in red down here. We had a decrease in the price level, so our CPI is going to be measuring lower, and we have a decrease in equilibrium real GDP. And so over here, we're going to say that when we have a decrease in aggregate demand in the economy, the price level will decrease, and also real GDP, equilibrium real GDP, will also decrease. Okay, I'm going to erase these notes here. Okay, all right, now let's look at aggregate supply. I think you should do the same thing again. I think you should pause the video and you should try and identify what an increase in short-run aggregate supply would look like on here, and then unpause the video and I will show you. Okay, so an increase in short-run aggregate supply is a rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Here's the short-run aggregate supply curve. So I'm going to put some right arrows. I'm going to go to the right side of the curve, and I'm going to draw some right pointing arrows. Now this is the one that looks a little weird to some people, because when you draw this curve to the right, this is what it looks like. So that's short-run aggregate supply prime. And what happens is, to some people, it looks like this curve is lower than this curve. It's below it. It does look like it's below it, and it is below it. But we don't think in terms of above and below. We think in terms of left and right. And right means higher. And so this means that short-run aggregate supply has increased. So let's find our new intersection point, which is right here. And if we do a horizontal dashed line, that takes us over to here. And a vertical dashed line takes us down to here. And if we look at the price level, we can see that the price level was at the black, and now it's at the blue. So what's happened is the price level has gone down, so our measure for CPI is going to be lower. Equilibrium real GDP, however, was here, and now it's over here to the right. That's an increase in equilibrium real GDP. And so when we have an increase in short-run aggregate supply in the economy, that's going to result in a decrease in the consumer price index, so a decrease in the price level in the economy, the level of prices, but it will result in an increase in equilibrium real GDP. We will produce more stuff, but prices will be lower. More stuff, but lower prices. That sounds awesome. I like this one a lot. Now let's see what happens when there's a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. And again, I think that you should pause the video, see if you can figure it out for yourself. All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. That's a leftward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Here's the short-run aggregate supply curve. So I'm going to draw a leftward arrow, and I'm going to draw the new short-run aggregate supply curve right here. So this will be SRAS prime. I'm going to look for my new intersection point with the aggregate demand curve. Now, I want to remind you something. You might be thinking, but what if the aggregate demand curve moved? Remember, in this class, we are ceteris paribus. We are only changing one thing at a time, one variable at a time. And this thing that we're changing, the only thing we are changing is short-run aggregate supply. Now, other things are changing as a result of us doing our change, but we are only applying a single change at a time. We're not going to move both curves at the same time. So we're moving the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. That's a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. We have found our new intersection point, and now we're going to draw a horizontal dashed line over to price level and a vertical dashed line down to real GDP. Now the original price level was here, and now our orange price level is up here. We had an increase in the price level. CPI is going to measure higher. That's inflation. We have inflation here. But equilibrium real GDP was here, and it moved to the left. That's a decrease in equilibrium real GDP. That's a bummer. We produce less stuff, but prices have gone up. I don't like the sound of that. That doesn't sound good for the economy, at least in my opinion. But that may be just a normative issue. You don't have to listen to me. So when short-run aggregate supply decreases, we will have an increase in CPI, but we will have a decrease in equilibrium real GDP. And that means that we'll have higher prices with less stuff. I don't like that. I don't like higher prices and less stuff. There's not as much stuff for me to buy, so I'm going to bid up the price because I have plenty of money in my pocket, but they're not producing as much stuff. So I'm going to take more of my money to buy less of the stuff. That just doesn't sound good. I don't want something like that to last for very long, okay? All right, so this is everything that you need to know about the dynamics of the aggregate market. You should be able to produce a graph of the aggregate market, and if I ask you to tell me what happens when either aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply changes, you should be able to tell me what happens to real GDP, equilibrium real GDP, and also to the price level, CPI. Okay, that's it, and we'll see you in the next lesson.